Hi, I'm Dan Kubisky, co-chair of the Society of Professional Journalists International Community. Recent events in the United States by the parent companies of the news and entertainment divisions of major U.S. networks have led many civil rights advocates to worry about the status of freedom of speech and press freedom, two freedoms guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution. Earlier this year, Paramount, the owner of CBS, settled a lawsuit President Trump brought related to the way the news program 60 Minutes edited an interview with the Democratic Party candidate Kamala Harris. Paramount was also in talks to merge with Skydance, a move that would require approval by the Trump administration. Just this past week, ABC, under orders from its parent company, Disney, temporarily pulled the plug on the Jimmy Kimmel Show after Trump appointed Federal Communications Commission Chair Brendan Carr attacked Kimmel for what he described as crass comments related to the killing of right-wing influencer Charlie Kirk. Almost immediately after the Carr comments, the owners of many of the ABC-affiliated stations said they were dropping the Kimmel Show because of the comments. The station owners, Nexstar and Sinclair, also have purchases planned that require FCC approval. For many, the comments by Carr made it clear that the FCC would not be looking kindly on the deals unless they did something about Kimmel. And just recently, we also have the Trump administration moving to limit journalist visas so they have to face renewal every 8 months. But these actions are not new. We've seen this before, and we still see it taking place elsewhere in the world. Here to talk about how pressure on news outlets and use of visa renewals have had an impact and still have an impact on press freedom, I welcome our good friend Eric Wishart, who is the Standards and Practices Editor for AFP, and as you can see from the picture behind him, lives in Hong Kong. Eric, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, good morning. We're waiting on a typhoon here, so
Hopefully we'll be able to get through this before the power goes out.
anyway, I wakened up to some good news that Jimmy Kimmel's coming back. So that was
That
a
is true. That's right. As he'll be back on Tuesday.
Mhm.
Okay, so could you just talk a bit about what you've seen in terms of the economic pressure on news organizations uh, in Hong Kong in particular, because that's where you are, and if you can tie in anything from mainland China that you feel comfortable talking about, that would be great.
I mean, I think the interesting thing, and I'm not a big fan of making kind of spurious comparisons, but and Hong Kong is a much smaller place than the United States, obviously, with a very different culture when it comes to freedom of speech. But the parallels have been quite interesting, I've found. Um, Having just lived through a very dramatic and fast transition in Hong Kong, I mean, up to basically the national security law, which was introduced in 2020 after a lot of protests in 2019, which became violent, which let's not forget that. From being a very open society where you could say anything you liked, including about the Tiananmen Square massacre, suddenly that stopped from one day to the next. And I think that was what shocked people so much in Hong Kong is, and they sort of continued the way they used to, but um, the realization took a while to sink in that things had changed. And it's been quite striking in the United States as well, how fast the Trump administration has moved against its perceived enemies in the media. I mean, Donald Trump came out and said it should be illegal. The criticism should be illegal that he accused a journalist of hate speech for asking a question last week. He essentially threatened an Australian journalist by saying, um, I'm meeting your prime minister next week, and I'm gonna talk to him about you. So there are parallels. The corporate aspect, um, the Apple Daily, which was founded by Jimmy Lai, who fled mainland communist mainland China when he was young, faced a de facto advertising boycott by established companies in Hong Kong. They wanted to please the government, and they felt advertising in the Apple Daily was going to be damaging to their image. So he was under that financial pressure. Then he faced accusations of colluding with foreign powers by encouraging sanctions against Hong Kong, and got arrested under the national security law. But his company, I mean, they went for the head. They froze the assets of Next Media, which was the parent company of the Apple Daily, which made it unviable, and it shut down with the loss of 1,000 jobs. And then they raided the offices of Stan News, which was another independent news outlet, and again it shut down. So about 10 independent media outlets shut down. So they've gone after not just the individual journalists, the pressure, either financial pressure or just the pressure of this new environment for freedom of speech in Hong Kong, forced the closure of around 10 news outlets. So and also this preceded that, but the South China Morning Post, which is the leading English language newspaper in Hong Kong, was taken over by Jack Ma of Alibaba, which is a big, gigantic mainland company. RTHK, which is the public broadcaster in Hong Kong, which, like the BBC, as a public broadcaster, was independent editorially. After the 2019 protests, they changed the director of broadcasting. They brought in a new editorial guidelines. They purged all the archives online. All these current affairs shows that criticized the government, showed the protests, were wiped clean from YouTube. It was a great archive, it's gone. And they chopped their satirical shows as well. So, I mean, the government really went after businesses, media outlets, as well as arresting individual journalists. So it was a kind of two-pronged approach.
Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned briefly the economic boycott, basically that was against Apple Daily. Is that is that still an issue in Hong Kong? I mean, they have the law now that they can shut down news organizations as they want based on their definition of security, but is there still some sort of economic pressure that's being put on maybe news organizations that don't report the news the way the government would like it to be reported?
I mean, they put pressure on in different ways. I mean, Ming Pao, a Chinese language paper, published an editorial or an opinion piece that the government didn't like recently. And one of the government officials, I can't remember if it was John Lee or Chris Tang, the security minister, or one of them came out and said that opinion pieces must be balanced and fair. And I teach journalism, and the whole point of an opinion piece is it has to be based on accurate facts, but the whole point is to give an opinion, to give a strong point of view. If you've ever read Thomas Friedman, he doesn't, he's got as he said, he wants to create heat and light, So there's this constant pressure. I mean, the big boil that they wanted to lance was the Apple Daily. I mean, we all knew that. And I mean, Jimmy Lai's trial has finally ended, but the judges said that they will announce the date of the sentencing in good time. So he's still being held. The legal wheels take time in Hong Kong. People are still facing trial over the 2019 protests. Another weapon that can be used is on the visa front. And this is why it was concerning to see what's happening with the change in the rules for visas, the I-visas in the United States. Trump administration wants to reduce, I think it's 5 years now.
As
to
the journalist works for an overseas news organization, the visa is good. So it's unlimited.
yeah.
Uh, and and then just you just have to report that I've switched from BBC to AFP.
Well, I think you get a 5-year visa now. It's up to 5 years.
Something like that, yeah.
They want to reduce it to 240 days, which is basically 8 months, and 90 for Chinese journalists. And the AFP was one of more than my news organization was one of more than 100 news organizations that published an open letter last week calling for the government, American government, to change its position on this. I mean, it just makes it impractical. How can you move to the United States on an 8-month visa? How can you rent an apartment? How can you enroll your kids in school? I mean, how can you do anything? Um, and it just puts that chilling effect potentially on your coverage. Just as here, I mean, the Bloomberg journalist Rebecca June Wilkins had her visa renewal had request denied a week or two ago. She's been a Bloomberg journalist in Hong Kong for 6 years. She is 1 year from becoming a permanent resident, and her visa application was refused, and they never give a reason. And another Bloomberg journalist last year had a visa request refused. And they were just the most recent of quite a fairly long list of visa refusals. So that has what we call a chilling effect, that you're under the situation that if I say something wrong that the government doesn't like, they won't renew my visa or they won't give me a visa. And in the current climate in the United States, if you're on a 240-day visa, you know that at the end of that period, your work will be scrutinized and you may well not have it renewed. And I mean, how can you make any kind of plans on an 8-month visa, for your family?
What does that mean to the
If
for the coverage
you go to
of these places?
sorry?
Right in Hong Kong, you have the uncertainty over visa renewal. We have this growing uncertainty in the U.S. What does it mean for the coverage of places that have this kind of uncertainty or will have this uncertainty?
I mean, I think that I don't, as far as I remember, AFP hasn't had any problems with visas, which doesn't mean it won't. I think if you're a big news organization, it's easier to deal with it. Just as if you're the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, it's easier to deal with a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit from Donald Trump. If you're Jimmy Kimmel, it's easier to deal with than if you're a small person in a small local TV station. So I think the big organizations can deal with it. But I mean, like freelance journalists, people who don't have that support, don't have the high profile, obviously they're walking in eggshells, right? But even then, I mean, it just shows you if they're going to not for a second time not renew the visa of a Bloomberg journalist. They're not scared of taking on a major news organization, and Bloomberg's been very quiet about it. There's been another thing that's not really been discussed in Hong Kong is that I was a member of the Foreign Correspondents Club, which you know, Dan, and I was actually president and vice president 3 times. And after the NSL, the club, I wasn't involved in the decision, cancelled the Human Rights Press Awards because they discovered that Stan News, whose journalists were facing sedition charges, had won some of the prizes. So rather than risk upsetting the government, which was their landlord, they cancelled the prize, right? And so that's one aspect of the sort of chilling effect that this climate has. And the yeah, I would just say even if you're not directly threatened or arrested or deported or you have your visa refused, um, you're always aware that they can. The bar in Hong Kong is 7 years. Once you pass 7 years residency, you're a permanent resident, so you don't have that visa issue anymore. So this was why this recent case with this Bloomberg journalist was particularly striking. I mean, she was 1 year away, she was 8 months pregnant, and they didn't renew her visa. Because of this environment, a lot of major, particularly American news organizations, will not allow their staff to become president of the Foreign Correspondents Club. So that's a form of self-censorship. Yeah,
Well,
he does.
You also have the case of the Wall Street Journal
Well,
with the with the Hong Kong Journalists Association.
I mean, the Wall Street Journal, while it was rightly fighting for the release of Evan Gershkovich, who was unjustly imprisoned in Russia, was firing Selina Cheng, who's a young Chinese woman in Hong Kong who was a staff member of the Wall Street Journal, who became the chair of the Hong Kong Journalists Association, which is it kind of operates as a press freedom advocacy organization and also as a trade union for journalists. And the Wall Street Journal fired her. Right. So I would say, to be polite, a lot of the big international news organizations, while preaching press freedom, online, internationally, are very skittish about running foul of the Hong Kong government, to the extent that they wouldn't even let a member of their staff become the president of the local press club.
They're also moving their bureaus out of Hong Kong for Asia coverage. I remember when Hong Kong was the center for Asia coverage, and now more and more are moving to either Japan, South Korea, and some in Singapore.
Bangkok. Some have gone to Taiwan. But the big, I mean, AFP still here. And Bloomberg have a big operation. New York Times moved some of their journalists to Seoul. Reuters is here. So, I mean, there's not been a significant move of international media out of Hong Kong for now,
What about the Hong Kong media? Uh, how are they dealing with? I mean, you have the law, the security laws that can crack down on reporting at any time, but in a more subtle way is the economic pressure that avoids the publicity of using the security law. Has there been pressure on the Hong Kong media to this time, or have they all fallen in line and it's not an issue?
I mean, I follow the Hong Kong Free Press, led by Tom Grundy, an independent English language outlet, has flourished, has survived, and they quite bravely, I would say, have an update, which a monthly update on the state of press freedom and the general security situation in Hong Kong, which the clock started when the national security law was passed. And I read that. I read the kind of, it's a very good archive. Anybody wants to know about what's happening in Hong Kong and the press freedom front. Reading it, I don't see them talking particularly about economic pressure. It's more just statements that it's more just the sort of moral pressure of the chief executive says the role of journalists is to tell good stories about Hong Kong. No, it's not. We're not propagandists. The role of a journalist is not to tell bad stories about Hong Kong or good stories about Hong Kong. I think there's a bit of a persecution complex. They always complain when foreign institutions or media criticize Hong Kong. My answer to that is always look at the coverage of Donald Trump in the United States, look at the coverage of Keir Starmer in Britain. I mean, that's just the way journalists work. You're not You know, they say it's smearing and it's unfair and unjust and hypocritical, but I mean, that's just the way journalists are. So the kind of pressure on that I can detect and, um, on the media. One thing they have been doing is a lot of tax audits. I know that there's a lot of that, and not just media particularly, but any civil society organizations. Recently, there's been a lot of tax audits. I know the Hong Kong Free Press has faced tax audits. So there's that. That's one channel of putting pressure on.
Mhm.
A lot of inspections. There was an independent bookshop that was permanently being inspected because they put a bookshelf out on the pavement, and finally they
Right,
gave up. They were just harassed. You
right,
know, they're
right.
just doing it. We got to keep the pavement clear, but it was finally they shut down. They just couldn't.
Yeah. We've done some interviews and discussions about the tax issue. So yeah,
So now that you ask me, that's one way they're doing it. Yeah,
yeah,
the government would just say this is just normal, good governance, but the people at the other end feel they're being harassed.
okay. Um, so I want to thank you very much for taking time in the middle of a pending typhoon from your busy schedule. It's always while it's not always great to hear the news out of Hong Kong or what the news is out of Hong Kong, it is good to hear about what is happening there. And I think you made it very clear that what we're beginning to see in the United States is something that those of us who have been in Hong Kong in the past have seen before and continue to see. That we do have these global connections that need to be addressed so that we may have a better way of addressing them when we see them appearing elsewhere. Uh,
One thing, Dan, I would say in finishing is that there are a lot of really good young journalists in Hong Kong coming up, you know. So it's not like people are necessarily deserting the profession here. And I mean, I get asked a lot, how can you cover Hong Kong in the current situation? I mean, the best thing you can do is just tell the facts, quote, quote the government. You don't have to embellish it. When John Lee says the role of a journalist is to tell good stories about Hong Kong, just quote him saying it. You don't have to embellish it. Just, as long as you keep it to the facts. They tend to go after opinion here, which they don't like.
right.
So there are a lot of, and I've had some pass through my classes and also I think this is something that a lot of people in America might not realize is a lot of the mainland journalists are very young journalists who come here are very open-minded and independent. I mean, I think there might be a perception that they're all sort of monolithic and or whatever, but I mean, there's some really great young journalists, both mainland and Hong Kong Chinese. So I
Yeah.
think that's a case for optimism, and they're willing to push the boundaries within the system.
You left us with an optimistic note.
Have to try to accentuate the positive, Dan.
Wishart, editor standards and practices for AFP based in Hong Kong, but a journalist of the world. Thank you very much for your time.
Dan, pleasure.